Good afternoon. Welcome to CSD for this event, which is one of our CSD exchange of democratic politics. I'm glad to see that you came very many of you came and are interested in this burning topic. So I think that we are going to talk for thinking about that populism. I'm going to give some kind of introduction to begin with, and then we are going to give the floor to our four people who are coming from different countries. Their first will be Pablo Cristinguy, from Podemos. He's in charge of the international relations of Podemos, and he's also an MP. So that's for Spain. Then we will have Samuele Mazzolini from Italy. Samuele is a student at the University of Essex, but he's also one of the organizers and inspiration for this movement, which is called Senso Comune, and who published some kind of call also for left populism well, except in the call it left populism. This is something that we are going to discuss, how to qualify in Italy. Then we have Christophe Ventura from France. Christophe is a researcher at the International Institute for International Affairs in Paris, and he is also an activist involved in La France Insoumise, very working closely to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and he's also the redacteur-en-chef of a very interesting online thing called Les Mémoires des Luttes, which is dedicated particularly to Latin America and social movement in general. And then finally we have our own Owen George from the UK. Owen is very well known from all of you. He's a columnist of The Guardian, and he's also a member of the Momentum, and he's a very well-known activist. They will have each 15 minutes to present their argument, and it's basically to ask them to say what is the situation with this left public movement in each of their countries, the possibilities, the difficulties, and after that we will have discussion among them. Then we will have a break, and in the second part of the event we will have a general discussion with the audience. That will be 5 to 6 years, and then we will have things that we can go on and some going forward discussion. Okay, so let me just put a few ideas. And of course, what I'm going to say, some things will come from. I don't pretend to be objective, so some people might disagree with what I'm going to say. I hope that we are going to have a very agonistic discussion. So what I want to say to begin with is that we could say that we are really living a populist moment. By that, what I mean, because I think when we speak of populism, it's very important to clarify what we mean. Obviously, and I think this is something we all share on this table, we don't accept this definition of populism, which is propagated by the media, that saying that populism is going to do with demagogy and making promises that we never intend to practice. Here I propose to follow Ernesto Lafleur, who in la populist reason is proposing to, he's got different some kind of analytical approach. He says populism, contrary to what it's not an is it okay to everybody can hear me? The back, yes? Louder. Very strange because normally I've got a low voice, so it's when I'm going to speak a bit. Is it okay like that?
Closer so you can change the microphones.
No, but this one.
No, I think that the problem is that it's not close enough to your mouth.
Not close enough to my mouth.
That's
okay? I'm not going to begin again, but just say, I'm following, when we define what is populism, I'm following the proposal of Ernesto Laclau, to say populism is not, certainly not a regime, that's quite important, it's not an ideology, it does not have a particular content, it just must be understood in an analytical way. It's a way to construct the political frontier, and it's a way to construct the political frontier on the basis of the people from the underdog and the people from above. So in general, the people against the establishment, the people against the elite. So this is a way of constructing the political frontier. So it does not have any particular content. So you can have in fact, it's a way to construct us and them, or we and they, or something like that. But obviously, as I'm going to say, this can be constructed in many different ways, and this is why we've got different forms of populism. But before moving to that, I think that it's important to try to understand why is it that there is today this populist moment. I mean, it is, in fact, by that I'm referring to emergence of a series of parties or movements precisely construct the political frontier in a populist mode. No? That is why the emergence of anti-establishment movement, there is something clearly which is happening today, which is a rejection of kind of politics which does not offer any alternative. No, this is so. It is why it's anti-establishment, anti-regime, anti-elite. It is something which is taking place in all European countries, of course in the US, but we are here going to concentrate mainly on Europe. For me, this emergence of those populist movements is not be seen as a consequence of what I call the fact that we are now in Europe living in post-democracy. Post-democracy, of course, is a term probably know that been called by Colin Crouch. It's developed in a way which is mainly dedicated to the economic analysis. I agree with that, but I add something more, which is also the question of what I call post-politics. Because I think we need to distinguish. When we speak of post-democracy, what we mean is that we are, of course, in societies which still go themselves democratic, obviously. They are still some of the procedure of democratic procedure, but they are in some cases working in kind of a goal because two main values of democracy, which are equality and popular sovereignty, have been eliminated from the political discourse. So we are in a society in which the ideas of democracy are not part of the political discourse anymore. And this, of course, this is why we can speak of post-democracy. And I will distinguish, in fact, two different aspects in this post-democracy. First, and this is the argument that I presented 10 years ago, no, 11 years ago, on the political, when I was criticizing the Blair and Labour and the third way. I was, in fact, arguing that we are now living in a situation which we can call post-political because there is no fundamental difference between the parties center-right and center-left. This is the consensus of the center. This is what I call post-politics, because politics require that there are alternatives for the citizens to choose. So when you got this consensus of the center, and of course, the main point there is, they will say, there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. Remember our Margaret Thatcher Tina. She is the one who first said that. But obviously, when Blair and Labour came to power, they accepted the terrain to be created by Thatcher, and this is something that later moved to other countries. We first we got the dubious thing that this was first developed in Britain, but then moved to Germany with the midterm struggle, and then moved to France. And today we can say that this kind of third way politics is in fact present in all European countries. In fact, it came recently to France, but Macron is, of course, the typical example of post-politics. it is interesting to see how I think sometimes come a bit later in France than in other countries. But 30 years after Tony Blair, the post-politics is represented typically by Macron in France. But I suppose that Christophe will tell us a few things about that. So post-politics, what does it mean? It means that in fact, when the citizens vote for the election, they don't really have a choice because they can not choose between, there is no alternative, there is only alternance in power between center right and center left. But no of this party propose an alternative. So this is why we can say that in fact the very idea of popular sovereignty is being eliminated. Because popular sovereignty means in that respect that citizens have really a choice. Remember, for instance, Pablo will say something about that. The indignados is something they used to say, tenemos un voto, pero no tenemos un voz. Tenemos vote, but not a voice. And of course, that's true. I think it shows exactly what is post-politics. You can go and vote, but in fact, since you vote for two programs which are more or less the same, you don't have a voice. Right? So this is the first element of pro-democracy. Is no more possibility for citizens to exercise their political sovereignty. The second aspect is more to do with the economic consideration, and is the fact that we have in the 30 years, and of course this is a consequence of neoliberal globalization, and post-politics is also a consequence of the victory of neoliberal hegemony. But in the case of economic aspect, we are witnessing a process of, we can really call oligarchization of our societies, because we have seen an incredible exponential development of inequalities. Now we are more and more in societies in which we've got a group of super rich, and then not only the working class or community completely abandoned, because if you believe that there is no alternative to globalization, you can't have a discourse with respect to the sector which are the losers of neoliberal globalization. And this is why increasingly in many European countries, the popular sector has been about that. They are simply not, the socialist parties or labor parties or social democratic parties don't represent anymore the rest of those people. But today we've got even more than that. We are witnessing a process of proletarianization, pauperization and precarization of the middle classes. So this is why the gulf between those things. This is in fact something that can be called an oligarchization of our society. And this is why there is some, point in common with Latin America. Because in Latin America, of course, the difference was there. The question was that where those oligarchies, and then the whole question, and this is why then we got this movement world from Latin America, they found a way to introduce the masses, to give them a voice. In our countries, it's different because in our societies, thanks to some advances of social democracy, I mean the real social democracy, not the kind of social liberalism that exists today. There's been already some incorporation of the masses in politics. But what we have been seeing in the last 20 years is precisely that those advances have been taken away. So we are losing the sayers of right that have been won by social democracy. So we are in a process of oligarchization of society which were not oligarchic. So, and this is why we can say that the second aspect of the democratic idea, the idea of democratic equality, is something which, of course, is also been eliminated. But it's not at all a priority in policies. And you will remember probably one of the topic of a new labor when they said, we are going to choose. Instead of equality, not choice. We are going to be able to to choose your doctor, this is the very idea of equality, which is so central for democratic discourse, is also eliminated. Those are the two aspects of pro-democracy. And my argument, in particular I'm open to that argument, is that this emergence of what we can call populist parties show a rejection of pro-democracy, a rejection of post-politics. it's a high claim of the people that we want to have a voice. So this is why, and this is, I know my thesis is a little bit controversial for some people, I think that we must see that what those movements express, and of course in certain cases in ways which are not acceptable, but it's real democratic demands. They want to recover democracy. So this is why I think it's very important when we are going to see how to react to that. We need to understand that because a lot of people are saying, oh, but no, those are people who they vote for it as well as party because they are intrinsically racist and they are homophobic, and so we should not take account of all of that. No, I think that's absolutely wrong. We should absolutely see why they are so many people from the popular classes, for instance, who have been attracted to parties like Front National in France, and see that behind the way in which it is expressed through xenophobic language, it's a real democratic demand. And this is, of course, why we need on the left to give a different answer to those to the demand. Yeah? So this is where we come to the differences between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. Because this frontier, this populist frontier, and the people and the establishment, can be constructed in very different ways. Because of course, when we speak of the people, we don't speak of something that exists. The people does not exist. What exists is the population. The people is always political construct. And it can be constructed in different ways. It can be constructed, for instance, in ways in which it is restricted to the national, to ethno-nationalist discourse, the xenophobic discourse, and in fact, and then the term is going to be seen, for instance, as immigrants, and the parties who in fact are responsible for the introduction of immigrants. But the people can also be constructed in a different ways. And for instance, I think that we see clearly recently in France the difference between the way in which Marine Le Pen constructed the people, precisely restricting the people to the national and putting the immigrants, especially the Muslim immigrants, outside the dam. And the discourse of Jean-Luc Mélenchon also was constructing the people. He wanted to federate the people, but of course it's a people which was much more open to the immigrants were part of that people, and also many other demands, many other democratic demands. So you see, one can distinguish different ways of constructing this populist frontier. We decided in here to call that left-wing populism, but there is quite a debate. At the moment, I know, for instance, somebody to speak of a democratic populism, manifesto. Some people prefer to speak of progressive populism. But I don't think that the term progressive is to refer to what I call left-wing populism. And then in this case, we will have a reactionary populism and a progressive populism. Progressive populism, I don't think it was said, but because in fact, Macron is just proposing France to call we are the progressive. So some people call authoritarian. I mean, I don't know. I personally think that we cannot, even if we accept, for that important point, that constructing the political frontier in populist terms means that it cannot be constructed as it's constructed traditionally on the basis of left and right. The traditional way of constructing the people on the basis of left and right does not work. But that does not mean that we can eliminate completely the distinction between left and right. I think that distinction needs to be told not in sociological terms, because of course we are not in this case of sector of the people whose interests are necessarily for the same. For instance, I think something which I found very interesting in Polymote, when they say that we don't want to speak exclusively to the people who consider themselves on the left. We also believe that there are many people who have been traditionally voting for the Parti Popular who can want to have a program. And I think that is the same with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Also believe that people can identify the program of l'avenir en commun, future in common, and it's not something that is always dedicated to traditional left discussion. That's quite important. discuss here if it's, why call it then populism or why not call it then populism. That's not my important. But the whole question, of course, is whatever the name you give to that kind of populism, what is the specificity of it? And I think that it's very important to realize that what is at stake is the articulation of a series of democratic demands. I mean, obviously the working class, but also the proletarianized, pulverized middle classes. But another important element is the articulation with a series of struggles, which are sometimes called struggle. I mean, the struggle, but and also the feminist, the minority, a series of democratic demands. So it's not demands which are only, let's say, demands related to the economy, but there is a multiplicity of very heterogeneous demands. So this is a point which is important, and it's also would be the origin of discussion. Because if you accept that those demands do not necessarily converge, that's why I think that the term convention of the village is problematic, because it means that there are the case of struggle, they all converge. No, of course, we know that there can be a lot of conflict and contradiction between the way which the demand of the women, for instance, are articulated. They can be articulated in the way which express the way which they don't take interest of the demand of the workers, of the immigrants. So those demands need to be articulated. We need in hegemony social strategy, the book that we call the speak of the establishment of a chain of equivalence between democratic demands. That's something which is absolutely crucial for understanding populism. But it also means, and I think here is another point which is controversial, you need to have an articulatory criticism. Because one critique which is made to populism is the role of the leader. Well, the leader is necessary because you need to have a way or they need them some kind of symbol which represents the multiplicity of them. So this is also something which is quite important, especially the role of the leader. And my last point, I mean, I'm going to be brief about that because it opens why we can ask, why is it that the left in general is so much difficult, unfortunately much more than in understanding this necessity to create a popular subject. And I think, probably because deviation from my profession of being a political theorist, I think that one important aspect is the fact that the left in general tends to be rationalist. They don't understand, for instance, the role of affects people. And I think we cannot really understand the creation of people. We don't understand the role of affect in this, because people need is a kind of crystallization of common affect. This is what creates identification of it. And if you start on the completely rationalist point of view, even to say no affect, there's nothing to do with the left. The left needs only to give arguments. Then we cannot really understand the way in which this populist movement can be created, or the way in which a collective will can be created. So I think that is also some point in which some of you might be coming from political theory need to think about that. What is needed in order to be able to pose the problem of populism in a way that going to help us understand what is the state there? We need to start from a completely different perspective. We need to start, for instance, from a perspective that we call anti-essentialist. The idea that identities are not there to be represented. Identities are always constructed. And that one of the main points of politics is precisely the construction of identity. So this is something which probably will take us to far away to discuss that, but I want to have this present in mind. That it's not simply a question. I mean, there is, when you see the term from Marx, we could say that there is an epistemological obstacle it makes people understand that, and it is their nationality. And we really need to overcome that in order to do the question of conflict in an adequate way. Okay, so too long, but I hope that it's a few points which we can the basis for the discussion. So now I give the floor to Pablo who is going to react and tell us some things from the point of view of Podemos and situation in Spain.
Thank you, Chantal, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to begin at that point, right, when you were mentioning this populist moment, right, whatever we call it. But something is going on, something is happening. From my perspective, this means focusing the analysis on a very concrete political reality. So I'm not speaking about this from the perspective of theory or the general logic of a political movement, but of very concrete historical events that are happening in Europe. I think that populist moment, or whatever we want to call it, has a clear starting point for us, which are the democratic uprisings of 2011, which is an ideological earthquake, so to speak, and gives place to a series of very concrete political interventions, that have a number of things in common. So here I'm speaking from our experience, but trying to open a little bit the lens. First of all, I think that there is a specific European component about many of these movements, which is related to the fact that they happen in the age of austerity. Austerity is not simply an ideological set of claims or beliefs. It's not simply a set of economic policies. Austerity, I think, that denotes a specific configuration of European capitalism that designs, that delimits a state of affairs for political intervention. So austerity means, in the words of the great Ellen Masings Wood, a specific form for the conflict between democracy and capitalism. So here are a few elements that I think characterize this political intervention in the age of austerity. First of all is that it happens after the financial crisis, and that means that in this configuration of the political economy, we have two apparently contradictory elements. First of all, we have the presence of this deregulated, all-powerful financial sphere where the financial elites can act with total impunity to operate what constitutes a massive transfer of wealth between social classes. So a reconfiguration, the destruction of the social structures of the welfare state in Europe, and a reconfiguration of social forms from that correlation of forces that puts the financial elites, so to speak, in that position of absolute domain, unrestricted power. But at the same time, this is combined with a massive, so to speak, rising state power, state intervention in the economy. And one would believe that the two things are contradictory. Well, we have seen exactly the opposite. It's not only the series of bailouts of the financial system, the massive injections of liquidity, so to speak. No, we have seen all over Europe how the interventions of states in the economy have increased dramatically since the beginning of the crisis, not to, so to speak, balance or to counter that transfer of wealth from the popular and working classes to the elites. On the contrary, to create the conditions under which the system can be preserved, rescued, and bailed out to basically and reinforce its stability. Second, we are doing politics in the age of austerity under very strict and solid configurations of supranational or transnational power. For us, it is obvious the role that the European Union plays in terms of what the Stability Pact, the European Semester, the Eurozone creates. Those are, so to speak, limits for political action that decrease the margins of intervention, even for elected governments, the experience of Greece shows it very clearly, but not only. It's not simply a matter of the European Union, the IMF, the Troika, even NATO. I don't know if you know, but for instance, the Spanish government has increased by 40% its military and defense budget for the next year. This is simply obeying, so to speak, the indication, the orientation given by NATO. I'm not saying this simply to say that these structures are evil. I'm saying this to say these are effective, solid limits for political action in the scenario that we have now. And they put significant pressure on state autonomy in the role that the state can have to counter these transnational logics. Third, we are doing politics in the age of austerity under conditions of ideological weakness. Ideological weakness. What does this mean? This means that, of course, this is the inheritance of a certain ideological perplexity of the left from the end of the Cold War, from very creative and interesting movements in the alter globalization movement and so forth, the new theories of social movements, new forms of organizations, all of this leading to the uprising of 2011, very innovative, creative elements, but at the same time, we are thinking from a certain, how to put it, we are orphans of a big theory with a capital T, right? We are not anymore, and I think this is an element of ideological novelty, defining ourselves in relation only to, so to speak, a set of theoretical elements that are very clear and are unquestionable for whoever calls himself or herself a progressive or a leftist. This means that this has reinforced the element of the need for the construction of identity. The questions of who are we are there, never answered in politics, but at the same time there is a pressure to construct the political subject, to construct ourselves as political subject that we are doing from a certain position of ideological weakness to begin with. Fourth, in the age of austerity we are doing politics with enormous, huge possibilities and opportunities. Possibilities and opportunities that, for instance, in my country didn't exist in at least the 3 decades before our appearance. Why? First of all, obviously, because there is a state of emergency, because there is a collapse of the economic system, because there is a collapse of the ideological system in place, because there is a collapse of the system of representation, the classical one. There is an organic crisis, there is a state of disbelief, there is a state of, even if ideologically weak, revolt and uprising against the establishment that opens a political space for contestation. Second, there is a moment of historical acceleration, and events, through a process almost of contagion, right, move from one place to another. There is inspiration from one process to another, and things that looked impossible suddenly become possible. Look at Bernie Sanders' campaign, at Melanchon's campaign, at our very existence. These things were not supposed to happen. Third, there is the collapse of the social democratic project, as we had understood it in Europe for at least 40 years. So, with no ideological horizon, with no political rigor, with no economic alternative. This is a common trend in all of Europe. Look at what happened in Greece, in Spain, in France, in the Netherlands, in Austria, even in Scandinavian countries. The social democratic family has been suffering a deep crisis, and that has opened up immense political spaces for the articulation of new political projects. So there is the political and ideological space to do new things. So within this age of austerity, doing politics in this age of austerity, what are some of the elements that define certainly Podemos, possibly some other movements that have appeared and gained strength during these years? First of all, a very important element, the electoral component. These are not movements that have been following the classical logic according to which you have to very slowly, very patiently, very solidly accumulate force in the social, accumulate force in the cultural battles, accumulate force in the unions, accumulate force in the ideological production, accumulate organization in the belief that then that would translate, when the moment would come, to political force through elections. Many of these movements have been created the other way around, precisely using an electoral opportunity using a campaign, taking the form of the campaign, and that has very deep consequences and implications to create organization, to create social mobilization. This is an element that is very, very important. Second, there is a very strong charismatic element in this movement, which is paradoxical or even contradictory with the very, very deep democratic elements that run through the movements of 2011. But all of these movements have also in common the presence, the operation of subjectivation, of creating a movement through the identification with charismatic figures, namely leadership. I'm not saying this is a good thing in itself, I am saying this is something that has happened and that is important to understand the way we are organizing ourselves, because it obviously also has shortcomings. Third, this has a lot to do with what Chantal was explaining. There is the activation of this very confrontational, very dialectical movement of the construction of a popular plebeian political subject. This is, the confrontation of the people versus the elites, the aggregation of demands, the equivalency of demands and so forth, in let's say, a collective idea, a collective articulation of the us against the them. This is the long way towards the 1%, the identification of who is the subject we are opposing and who is the subject that is being mobilized in this manner, that in a certain sense depends on our ability to maintain, to expand, and to translate that confrontation in very different fields of political, economic, and social life. Then there is a very important element which has to do with the rupture of the hegemonic monopoly on essential elements of our social life. For us, it was, Chantal has mentioned also, the 15M, the Indignados movement, that in a certain sense broke the monopoly that political, cultural, mediatic elites had on words, to begin with, on the meaning of words, of what could be said, of what was visible in our society, of what made sense in our society. There was a huge crisis that was broken by popular mobilizations in Spain, and that opened up the space for a confrontation, a struggle, a political fight for the meaning of things, and words, symbols, phrases, all sorts of ideological tools that were unavailable for the left in Spain suddenly became at the center of the political battle. Now we can say things, now we can create, build, and construct meanings that were impossible a few years ago. That has put the, how to put it? Symbols, concepts, and words, many of them which were completely alien and completely foreign to the culture of the left, at the center of the political arena, the political battlefield. So we are fighting for the meaning of things that did not belong to our original political cultures. And in a certain sense, that constantly draws the lines of the political confrontation in a way that forces you to be flexible also. That forces you to think in strategic terms about what are the battles and what is the order of the political battles that can create the most advantageous correlation of forces for what? For a process of social and political transformation. There are also a few weaknesses. I will say them very, very fast so I can basically shut up already. First of all, this implies a certain lack of stability or of solidity of the ideological basis. It is very difficult to maintain that confrontation, that constant recreation and re-articulation of the political subject when you do not have the tranquility and the comfort of having the big theory, right? The big theory who always tells you, no matter in what state the confrontation is right now, you are right, you are on the right side of history, and eventually the big crisis will come and we will win. That's what a big theory does, right? Well, we are creating it constantly anew, and it is very difficult to maintain, so to speak, that frontier of the confrontation Also because of another implication, is that these organizations built from campaigns with a charismatic element, blah, 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 lack a certain organizational strength, a certain organizational culture. This is something that needs to be invented and that it is very difficult to sustain. There is a very famous sentence saying organization defeats time, and time is always a problem when you're trying to organize a political organization that needs to live longer than the people who create it, basically. That's a huge challenge. We are facing a very unfavorable correlation of forces because we do not have the kind of counterpowers that the left have built in many countries in Europe for decades. Newspapers, unions, universities, etc. That whole model of counterpower society that served as not only as a as a support, but also as so many trenches to which you could retire, right? To have safe spaces in society. Liberalism had emptied those spaces in Spain. You know, they had systematically emptied the meaning and the force of these social agents. And finally, and this is my last point, has to do with what Chantal was mentioning about the lack of content. We see that one common problem that we have, which is also an opportunity, but it's a common problem, is the lack of an alternative economic horizon. That there is no alternative. It's not only a tool that the right wing and the neoliberalism has used in order to disempower people. It has become, given the architecture, given this operation of austerity, given the correlation of forces in our society, has become a massive restraint that forces us to reimagine and refigure what the economic alternative means in concrete terms. What is the plan to construct it? Not simply a series of good ideas in economic terms, but a cool, serious, solid, alternative political economy. That is to be recreated, that is to be redone in Europe right now. This, in definition, that lack of content that you were referring to in theoretical terms, has a few political dangers. One of them is the fact that these spaces that are open, these new political spaces that are open and ideological spaces that are open, are under the risk of being re-articulated and reappropriated in very concrete terms by not simply right-wing populists or conservative populists, by, this is another important debate that is going on, by neo-fascist forces in Europe. In a certain sense, these forces are taking advantage of all these elements I've been describing in order to do what reactionary forces have always done, which is basically to refocus the issue away from the issue of property relations, social justice, democratic equality, and so forth, towards an idea of social order. Not social justice, but social order. This is a very effective operation in times of uncertainty and in times of where people don't have clear horizons for their lives. Then there is another kind of reappropriation that you were mentioning too. It is this new kind of populism of the far center or the extreme center, right? Basically, people buying all these, many of the formal aspects of these operations, of the formal organizational aspects of this, but simply voiding them of any kind of political or economic content. Possibly the best operator of that kind was Obama, but Macron today is the very image of that. It's a political geography where the left versus right collapses, where all these elements, of the new forms of organization, charismatic figure, blah, 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 all of this is present, except there is no content whatsoever of social justice, except that it is simply an operation to maintain, preserve, and reinforce the status quo. There is a Rutte in the Netherlands, is another example. Renzi in Italy is another example. This figure that simply it's a new version of the there is no alternative that basically are reinforcing the status quo and making politics impossible. possible. So one element that I think is key facing these challenges is not simply dialogue. We have seen that all these movements have been able to copy themselves from one another, to inspire themselves from one another. There is a certain mimesis of these movements, right? Reappropriation of things, but there is still a lack of organization between them. Organization means to share resources. So I will end up on this note. Basically, I think that the challenge that we have ahead is how to articulate these different movements in what could be and should be called a democratic international, a populist international, maybe. The way of fighting those battles together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pablo. Now I give the floor to someone who's going to tell us about the
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first thank Chantal for the kind invitation and say that I'm truly honored to be sharing with you the roundtable put by such high level.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah. Hello? All right. Before I plunge into the nitty-gritty of the analysis of left-wing populism in Italy, let me frame how, more generally, Italy has become one of the most regional and intense laboratories of populism in Europe. While the period between the end of World War II and the outbreak of the Brightville corruption scandal in 1992 is taken to be as one relatively free of full-blown populist practices, a closer look will reveal the presence of at least a few noteworthy populist fanatics. Among these, the Common Man's Front experience between 1945 and 1948, and the 1950 mayoralty of Achille Lauro in Naples represent almost archetypical expressions of right-wing antagonistic discourses that pit the men of the street, typically uninterested in politics, against the tyranny of political parties, and which make of theatrical and cheap outbursts one of the cornerstones of their politics. These basic coordinates seem to be still defining contemporary reactionary populisms in Italy. However, there was another practice which tended towards the populist pole in the same historical period, one which is of much greater interest for our purposes today. I am referring, of course, to the Italian Communist Party led by Palmiro Togliatti. It is not very common in Italy to admit the presence of populist traits in the Communist Party. Yet with Ernesto Laclau, I believe that the politics of Partito Nuovo, enacted by Togliatti upon his return to Italy in 1944, attempted to disjoin the components of the power bloc in order to rejoin them around the counter-hegemonic pole. In other words, it is the articulatory character of the Italian Communist Party and its relative capacity to coalesce a number of heterogeneous constituencies and diverse popular struggles in a broad popular identity that accounts for its populist tendency. Moreover, the dichotomic frontier that the Communist Party maintained versus both fascism and capitalism alike makes such a depiction warranted. However, Laclau is equally right in stating that structural limits impeded the Italian Communist Party to become a fully fledged populist movement, as the heavily charged communist ideology made it impossible, quote, to move beyond a certain point in the direction of constituting itself as the anti-signifier unifying the historical singularity, end quote. I do agree with the interpretation of Laclau, but not without a qualification. In particular, if it is well true that elements of a populist approach were certainly there in the Communist Party, there also lurked the seeds of a very different approach to politics, one which started to germinate more clearly from the 1970s onwards. In assessing the legacy of Togliatti, in a 1975 conference, Lucio Magri, a prominent heterodox figure in the Communist Party, and of his manifesto editorial experience, distinguished between an alive and a dead part of Togliattianism, where the former corresponded to the growth of a common sense and the activation of the masses starting from their needs, and the latter to the renouncement of any component of utopian Marxism. It is certainly not my aim to retrieve the teachings of Fourier here today, but I do buy the reasoning about a Janus-based nature in Togliatti's politics, of which only the most unpopulist part seems to have been upheld in the ranks of the left. And I'll return to this shortly. In the 1990s, instead, we had the thriving of populist discourses. While in the rest of Europe, the order alternation between two dominant parties or coalitions seemed to be a quite consolidated phenomenon, in Italy, the political landscape was one of complete wreckage, which paved the way for the intervention of new political projects, creating a sharp frontier with the old political system. The Christian Democrats and the Italian Socialist Party had collapsed, with hundreds of their most distinguished members arrested. While the Italian Communist Party had also just gone through a painful phase to its dissolution and a social democratic reconversion. However, while traumatic events that provoke political disorientation do not have necessary developments, the common sense of those years made it difficult for a left-leaning populism to emerge. The fall of the Soviet Union, the spread of the Yuppie culture and social rampantism, the exhaustion of political commitment, the collective imaginary of debauchery epitomized by the journalistic expression Milano da bere, drinking Milan, the diffidence towards anything the strong of bureaucracy and state, the strengthening of the fashion, telecommunication, and marketing sectors in northern Italy account for the rise of populists located on the right side of the spectrum, such as those of Berlusconi and the Northern League. The new populist window has opened since 2011, but while it is a relatively new one in the Western world, the case of Italy is almost a prolongation of the one which began in the 1990s. However, this time, there's an element of difference. While political scandals continue to be part of the day-to-day, the growing perception of inequality, the oligarchization that Chantal referred to earlier, loss of communal bonds, and the very material hardship brought about by the economic crisis created potentially different scenarios. No longer social rampantism then, but the realization of the increasing precariousness of jobs, pensions, schools, hospitals, life. And yet, no true left-wing populism has emerged. What have we had instead? Two new populisms trying to exploit the situation and come out. One is that of the Five Stars movement led by Beppe Grillo. Everyone will have heard about it. How to define Grillo's politics? If one compares the political language of the Common Man's Front of the 40s and that of the Five Stars, many striking similarities will become evident. Specifically, it is the drawing of a political frontier between honest and dishonest, where the latter is embodied by self-interested political elites to be at the forefront of the political battle. More in general, it is arguable that the so-called moral question in Italy is turning into an empty signifier, a truly societal mythical horizon capable of reordering political allegiances. The peculiarity of such an empty signifier is that its utterly moral character makes it possible to fill it with any content. Yet, despite the similarities with the Common Man's Front, it would be difficult to pin down the discourse of the Five Stars as openly right-wing. And yet, but neither would it be possible to label it as left-wing. The point here is that the operation of the Five Stars has been that of articulating around this cleavage a vast array of constituencies and identities that stand at odds with each other. Put more crudely, it has speeched both from the disillusion of the left and those of the right, trying to recuperate claims pertaining to both sides while subsuming them under a new identity that shuns any type of old symbolism or liturgy. This is why we see, quite paradoxically, coexisting together vindication as diverse as a basic income and a constant flirtatious attitude with xenophobia. In this sense, let alone all the historical specificities, and thinking only in very formal terms, the operation of Grillo is reminiscent of that of Perón in Argentina, who was able to construct a hypertrophic equivalential chain where a bit of everything could be found. This is why any attempt to define with precision the ideological coordinates of the Five Stars is doomed to failure. That of the Five Stars is an intrinsically ambiguous discourse, one which has been constructed not so much through the mobilization of social sectors, but by obtaining a passive consensus predicated on the technical individuation of the most widespread position among the electorate on the most salient political issues. The other populist practice is what I call half-jokingly, half-not, a centrist type of populism. In the Italian context, this tendency has been embodied by Matteo Renzi, despite the fact of carrying out his operation within the central left party and not against it. It is in many respects akin to the operation of Macron in France. In terms of normative orientation, Renzi does not represent, however, a qualitative shift with respect to the social democratic leaders that he had displaced, but is to be considered as the apex of a long process initiated precisely by former communists such as Occhetto, Veltroni, and D'Alema. It was this group to move what remained of the old Communist Party to the center and progressively embrace the neoliberal credo. In this sense, if we look at the actual policies that Renzi has implemented, he is a strenuous defender of the socio-economic status quo, one that strengthens an alliance between the economic elites of the country and the upper and the echelons of the middle class, especially those that fall under the rubric of the guaranteed, in other words, the holders of stable jobs contracts. It is the form of Renzi's sudden rise to prominence that represents a true break with past practices of that political tradition. The role of the leader, as in the case of Grillo, after all, is certainly fundamental here, as much of the novelty revolves around his very capacity to arouse political passions and connect with a number of existing demands. At the same time, Renzi has to an extent attempted to ride the honest-dishonest divide, but it has been the introduction of other related frontiers to have been decided. In a gerontocratic country such as Italy, the new old frontier has certainly been of great resonance. All were the political leaders of his own party that he, Renzi, only in his late 30s, now early 40s, wanted to scrap. And all was the political system that he wanted to reform through supposedly modernizing constitutional reform that in the end, as we know, failed to be approved in a referendum last December. New, old, modernizing, anti-modernizing, progressive, conservative. These are the binary frontiers that Renzi has deployed fairly successfully so far. However, his populism has been utterly gattopardeso, a change so that nothing changes. Why then, we should wonder, hasn't a truly left-wing populism emerged in Italy? Populism has been a stranger to the Italian left over the last few decades. Top of left-wing populism still horrifies the bulk of the radical left in Italy. In response to the roundtable question then, the future perspective of a left-wing populism, a la Podemos or a la Mélenchon for that matter, are for now still quite bleak. Different factors pertaining to what might be termed the field of militant anthropology account for this. These characteristics are not to be found in all groups, and not in all the same amount, but they're all equally inimical to the possibility of creating a people on clearly emancipatory lines. Let me enumerate them somehow schematically. Number one, much of the left has uncritically assimilated the mild institutional leaning that the Italian Communist Party started to display from a certain point onwards, contributing to a political culture prone to compromise with other forces. The origin of this is threefold. First, the Soviet gradualism enshrined in the politics of frontism of Western Communist parties. Secondly, and relatedly, the need of the party to legitimize itself in the 60s and 70s as a credible and respectable actor in an environment, in a tense environment, that looked at it with suspicion, and hence the decreasing surge of consensus in the terrain of civil society, coupled with the increasing surge of consensus in the slippery terrain of political institutions. Thirdly, the influx deriving from the conquest of hundreds of municipal, provincial, and regional governments, which created a very different mentality among those cadres occupying the spaces, especially the strongholds of central Italy. Number two, the left still insists on foregrounding its leftist identity, together with all its liturgies and symbolisms, and is equally obsessed with fetishes such as the unity of the left or the legitimacy of giving birth to a left constituent process. The truth, however, is that fewer and fewer people in Italy are appealed by the signifier left, or by discoursing trying to elicit consensus by making outright reference to communism, socialism, and so on. To some, the left refers to a form of elitist intellectualism, to a selling out to liberal values, to those who are not yet unpopular reforms. To some others, it is a synonym of inefficiency, bureaucracy, or even worse, authoritarian rule. Its original metaphorical value has thus been lost, and with it, all the positive connotations. In this sense, putting the leftist identity first represents a major obstacle in the attempt to create a people and reach out all those that haven't yet taken the vows. Number three, another similar problem is the pretension to know better. This Platonic approach is quite ubiquitous in the left, and I'm sure not only in Italy. leftists claim to be endowed with a better knowledge, to be the holder of a truth that needs to be disseminated in order to enlighten the people. So instead of projecting aggregating horizons so as to put together the victims of this socio-economic system, the left insists on the stark division between doxa and episteme, and consider its role as that of a messiah. In practical terms, this often means adopting behaviors that show a complete alterity with respect to common people, but it is not rare to witness feelings of utter disgust and haughtiness towards them. This collocates the left much closer to rational liberals than to the losers of the current order, who are left to be hegemonized by the likes of Trump and Le Pen. Number 4, some currents of the left have shifted their attention away from socio-economic issues, putting the question of civil rights at the forefront of their battles. Much like the neoliberal feminism phenomenon recently illustrated by Nancy Fraser, or the cooptation of the artistic critique of 1968 at the hands of capital as described by Boltanski and Chantal, the way in which such struggles are framed makes them prone to fight for formal types of equality, which are easily subsumed by the current order, making it difficult to think in terms of collective subjects. While I do not dispute the importance of some of these issues in the path to human emancipation, the struggles are imbued with an ethos of difference that runs counter the intuition of bidding equivalential change between unmet demands under the banner of some noble points that necessarily needs to be won with the majoritarian projection. Number 5, the influence of operaismo and post-operaismo in Italy is also hostile to the perspective of creating a left-wing populism. Their allergy to a national horizon, their insistence on strategy of exodus, their spontaneous immanentism that discourages any attempt of organized articulation, their reluctance to accept that leaders can facilitate social and political transformation are elements that have come to permeate a variety of political cultures in the country. In the last few months, a number of young intellectuals, students and workers, including myself, have united to give birth to a collective that advocates the need of a democratic populist politics in Italy. We have decided to call ourselves senso comune, as Chantal anticipated, which means common sense, in order to convey the idea that we need to get our hands dirty in, quote Gramsci, conception of the world which is uncritically absorbed by the various social and cultural environments in which the moral individuality of the average man is developed, quote. Not in order to provide a static exaltation of it, because we are aware of its, quote, fragmentary, incoherent, and inconsequential, end quote, character, but because we think that any democratic leftist option must restart from the very bottom and be able to speak the language of the average people. We don't know how far we will go. Structural difficulties remain. The anthropological aspects of the left that I've just mentioned. The presence of the 5 stars which functions as a stopper as it continues to play the role of an outsider. The absence of social movements of the kind witnessed in 2011 in other countries. Possibly even the fact that the crisis has not been as harsh as in other places. However, our endeavors are aimed at creating the preconditions, possibly the cultural preconditions for such an option to emerge. In 2, 5, 20 years, well, that we don't know. What we know is that Italy deserves better, and the left-wing populism would be the option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chantal. Hi to everyone. I'm very happy to be there, and I'd like to thank Chantal for the organization of this meeting, which is, from my point of view, the first initiative trying to open a European space in order to discuss this populism issue from a left-wing populism perspective. So I think this meeting is very useful in the process of what we can see all over Europe today. For the last 20 years, France has suffered a slow but growing economic and social crisis on the one hand, and on the other hand, crisis of legitimacy of politics, institutions, parties, partisan system in general. I should say, crisis of the political legitimacy to handle, to manage concrete and daily problems of the people. That's what we have known in my country for the last 20 years. Not to be too long, but just some key moments in order to understand the process where we are today. First, alarm, if I can say, 2002. The Social Democrats, the Parti Socialiste, is punished by the people, especially its own people, if I can say, who put in the second term of the presidential election the National Front against Jacques Chirac. That was the first systemic alert in the country. Second key moment, 2005. And I think that today in France, the rise of this debate on populism is directly connected to this 2005 moment, because it has opened a new sequence. 2005, the Parti Socialiste and the right wing threatened the popular vote against the project of European Constitution. The French people, the popular sovereignty, say no to this constitutionalization of neoliberalism within the EU, with 55% of the vote, but both socialist and conservative right-wing people decided to walk and to put in the trash the French vote, and decided to implement the content of this project. So that was made precisely in 2008 by Mr. Sarkozy, with a new project of European Treaty was basically the same picture than the one before. And when came to power François Hollande in 2012, saying that one of his commitments was to renegotiate the European treaties, and when he said too that his personal enemy was were the financial markets, he won the election on those two, let's say, options. And obviously, when he came to power, he directly done the contrary of what he promised to the people. So that's the, let's say, the deep process of what's coming, what has come in my country, and what you have seen a few weeks ago, in order to understand the whole context of where we are. So, a broad and deep crisis of legitimacy of all parties, because first of all, people understood perfectly well, first, that there was a sort of neoliberal consensus between the two traditional government parties coming to power, the one after the other, and always implementing, with some nuances sometimes, but implementing the roadmap, the neoliberal roadmap against the people. So that's the point. Crisis also of organizations, of unions, crisis of intellectuals, people who are committed to this whole period. So that's where we are. The National Front, in some way, is a sort of a result, a creation of this acceleration of rupture between the system and the people. And that's why we have to understand that the National Front is not only terrible, and we should criticize them from a moral perspective. We have to understand that those people are the product of what have been done by those who have the responsibilities to implement what people wanted. And so in this perspective, I agree with Chantal when she said we have to understand that this party is also, I would say, unfortunately, is also a sort of a frustrated expression of democratic demands crushed by the traditional parties. That's true. And that's the point. If we don't understand that, we don't understand why they are so strong in the country, especially where the left was before strong. When I'm talking about the left here, I'm talking about the Communist Party in the north of France, in the east France, and etc. It's another story in the south of France where this party is much more connected to the classical extreme right Vichist party. But the expansion of the Front National has to be understood in this perspective. So, on this background, we have seen during the last year we have seen the growth of this debate on populism in France. It has become, this debate on populism has influenced a lot our debate in France, first at the intellectual level, and for the last 2 years, more or less, it has become a real category of the political debate in the country. And it has won a strong position in the political debate, this populism issue. First, through this populism issue, I think that what has come back on the front line of the political debate in France is the people and democracy. People and democracy as a structuring category of our debate. That's the organization of the coming back of those two issues, people and democracy. And second, we can see the growth of this populism issue in the intellectual landscape, because there is a sort of overrun of books, articles, reviews, debates, academic, in different spaces, academic ones, university, but also in much more popular spaces like TV, radio programs, etc. And Chantal is well paid, if I can say, as we say in French, to know that, because when she's coming in France, she's literally absorbed by this whole machine today that is discussing all the time populism. But in the first place, what the hegemony was for the right-wing populism in my country, with the Front National. But today what has changed is that precisely this idea of a left-wing populism is growing and giving and winning space in this conflict or discussion about what is populism and what kind of option it can take. So that's where we are today, and that's good news, because it means that it's taking part from this new reorganization or building of new kind of political democratic subject in the country, who are progressively mobilizing people, ideas, and new forms of organizations in order to offer another option for the exit of the authoritarian, as we say in French, crisis, neoliberalism, consensus, and a return of traditional parties. So that's where we are, where we were, during these 2 last years in my country. In this context, we have a special situation right now. In France, at the same time, left-wing populism, I'm speaking precisely about left-wing populism now, has a pretty well-advanced position, as I told you just before, but in the same time, it's still a category or concept questioned to, disputed by, at the same time, different actors. On the one hand, the system, but it's normal. I mean, the system, the mainstream media system, precisely, is very hard with populism in general, but also with left-wing populism, saying more or less that it is populism is something that is used to disqualify people who are protesting or are mobilizing massive people against the oligarchic democracy that we are living in, against the fact that social needs and democratic needs are not taken into account by powers, institutions, state, and all the people who are saying that, who are fighting against a certain idea of a passive citizenship, finally, all those people are disqualified, are underlined like subversive people, dangerous people, demagogues, etc. And obviously, this is the first place for people who are also working or trying to work within this left-wing populism idea. So that's on the one. But on the one hand, we also have to confess, to admit that a part of the left, of the traditional left and the radical left organizations is not comfortable with the left-wing populism idea. I'm speaking especially, it's a bit schematic, sorry, but about certain sectors of Marxism, of Trotskyism, of libertarian people and anti-globalist people who are not comfortable with this idea, and we will see why. We will see right now why. Because I think that basically populism, either it's coming from the right or the left, at the end is something that leads to authoritarianism. That you can't build a political subject through a specific relationship between the leader and the people. That we have to organize a self-organized and autonomy within the people without linking them to the authority of a leader. That's basically one key criticism coming from the radical left against left-wing populism. That's the fact also that we can't be the people category only by the creation of a frontier between us and them. They say in some more traditional Marxist way that we have to be the coalition of social interest able to have a general project for the whole society, and not only in order to be the conflict between us and another part. That's more or less the critics that are disputed today. But I mean, it's good news that we have this dispute, because it means that it has re-engineered theoretical, strategical, and political discussions within a left who was quite dead before, quite without any perspectives. So at least something has been posed, a new general strategic and conceptual discussion within the left in the country. Let's review what it's giving to the country concretely from a left-wing perspective. The concrete perimeter of the discussion is called France Insoumise in France. It means something like defiant France. It should be something like that, or dissident France, which is the movement launched by Jean-Luc Mélenchon for the preparation of the last presidential election, because that's a new actor in the French landscape. Alors, Mélenchon, I would say, doesn't call himself or assume himself as a leftist populist. He say that I don't want to assume this name. Why? Because if I do that, I will waste my time explaining what I am not, in order to explain what I want to do and what I am. I will waste my time to answer to media, journalists who will always try to disqualify me because I'm a so-called populist. So he said, I'm not assuming myself like this. But the truth is that he's doing left-wing populism concretely. That's what he does. He's applying and adapting the theory in order to build its own strategy. He's calling this dynamic in another way. He called that to federate the people in order to, let's say, to reformulate the left. That is a roadmap. Federate the people in order to reformulate the left. Why to federate people? It means the populist strategy. It means the equivalence chain. It means how to build articulation, transversality between heterogeneous demands, social, democratic demands, of people who are not themselves living themselves in a sort of affiliation to a left or right-wing camp. But you can use and you can find issues, you can find campaigns, themes who are able to talk to different people in different levels of society. And you can articulate all those people through the formulation of a discourse, of a discursive strategy. You can speak to everyone, or at least to a large part of the society, in order to remobilize them and to give them more conscience, political conscience, in the political conflicts they will have with the other parts, the oligarchy, the casta, etc., etc. So, from that point of view, the strategy federates the people is clearly inspired by the left-wing populism approach, strategy. So that's what Mélenchon has tried to do. On the one hand, with a clear, all this discursive strategy is based on 2 or 3 main ideas. What are these ideas? First of all, we understand that we are in a sort of a moment of strong crisis of legitimacy, as I told you. We're in a sort of destitute moment where people want to reject all the powers, all the parties, all the institutions, etc., because there is a rupture of trust, etc., etc. But at the same time, a destitute moment is not enough. You have to go from that point in order to build a new balance for the political community. And that's the idea. How to do that? To use first, let's say, a first set of values, principles. Justice, social justice, equality for all, and popular sovereignty in anything. That's the core of Mélenchon's proposal. Articulated to the proposal, to the idea of the necessity of a new economic model for the country, for Europe, and for the world. That's the eco-socialism. Mélenchon called that like this. It's a sort of ecological transition based on the idea to change the structure of the productive system. For example, to brackets, this item is very important to touch middle-class people. Very important. Middle-class people, human people, who are a minority in the country, but who are the ones who are very active in the social relations dynamics. So it's a way to mobilize people who were not really mobilized before, who was consuming politics more than being active in politics. So that's, for example, one aspect of the general strategy. And all this in order to organize the recovery of sovereignty in everything, as I told you. And this is supposed to speak not only to the leftist people, but to all people in general. The recovery of social rights, of popular sovereignty in everything is something that can touch everybody. But why to recover sovereignty? For example, the Front National is saying exactly the same thing. In France, the Front National is presenting himself as a party who wants to recover popular sovereignty. But it's not for the same project. In the one hand, for the Front National, it's to recover popular sovereignty from supranational institutions, in brackets, supranational institutions where the French state is one of the key players. So it's a bit hypocrite, but in order to reduce this sovereignty at the national level, in order to reduce the autonomy of unions, the autonomy of social organizations, in order to reinforce, enhance the power of a state disconnected from society, based on the idea of a strong party, etc., etc. The project for them is to do that from a political view, to organize a sort of weakness of social forces in order to help and to support the national entrepreneuriat in the general worldwide concurrence, in order to give them new margin of powers. That's the idea. Less unions, more power for national firms in the international concurrence. That would be more or less what is the Front National project. It is not to change the productive system. It is not to transform the balance and the relationships between capitals and peoples. It is not to change the set of rights for people. It is not for that. It is for the contrary. Precisely, Mélenchon is coming with this strategy explaining we are doing that because we will give more sovereignty to the society. We will organize a more efficient relationship between state and people through the control of parties, more controls of parties, of representatives, more implication of people in public affairs. That's more or less what he proposed, which is completely different. And on this road, on this way, he started to mobilize people, and what is very impressive in the campaign we had is that for the first time, the growing of the National Front has been slowed by Mélenchon. And even we know that probably something like around 10% of the people who voted Mélenchon the first term were voters of the Front National. Voters from the Front National, the one I was telling you, the one who were, let's say, what I call myself the social Front National voters. The one who are voting for them because they were trashed, they were threatened, they were, literally, they were laughing at all the time by the parties. Those ones finally thought that maybe with Mélenchon we can return, we can have more democracy, and we can change of system in a positive way. So that's very important what happened, apart the fact that he lost, he didn't go to the second term. But it's very important for that, because it proves that it's possible to inverse the dynamic. So that's on the one hand. On the other one, too long. Okay, last word. Left-wing populism too, because the way he organized the defiant France was very new. I will be short, maybe the debate I explain more, but it was inspired at the same time by the Podemos experience, by some other experiences too, like Dan Sanders, and the fact that he integrated two social networks, new technologies, not only like a sort of echo for what you say, but a way to democratize democracy, a way to be the discourse in order to articulate, respecting the strategy of articulating heterogeneous and different demands through these new tools, who are more or less used in order to build a new form of politics, a new form of organization, which is not terminated today, because after the election this process has to continue, and that's one of the challenges that we have, to build this movement in a sort of permanent, efficient, and at least at the same time in the institution, at the same time in the society, in order to keep all the people gathered during this period of the Federate People strategy. But we finish now, and I hope that we will discuss this dimension later. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. So we come to the UK, and we are going to hear what our
well, thank you. Firstly, it's an honour to be here on this panel. Full disclosure, when I agreed to do this maybe a couple of months ago, I thought, well, the end of May is normally a quiet period, isn't it, in politics? One or two things have intruded since, so I've been rather preoccupied. However, I will try and this is a rather sketchy argument, which I will go into in terms of what I think is happening here at the moment in the context, of course, of left-wing populism. Now, I think it's welcome we're having this discussion, because in popular political media discourse in Britain, populism generally has come to denote the forms of nativism, xenophobia, which we see rise across the Western world, whether it be the Faragists, whether it be Brexitism, if you like, which is as much a political or more political and cultural counter-revolution as it is anything to do with Britain's relationship with the European Union, of course the National Front in France, Trumpism, and so on. And I think clearly there's been a lack of examination, for obvious reasons in the media at least, of the forms of left-wing populism which have emerged, which are all very specific to the cultural, political and historical context of each country. Bernie Sanders is a very peculiarly American phenomenon, of course, it owes so much, not just when you go back, agrarian populism and the forms of American socialism, Eugene Debs and all the rest you saw at the beginning of the 20th century, but Occupy and the space that opened up, which was a necessary precondition for what Bernie Sanders represented, of course, Podemos and the Indignados, Syriza in Greece, whose origins, so much to do with the Greek Civil War, if you go back. And in this country, which is obviously what I'm going to focus on, this is quite unique. I don't want to go to kind of British exceptionalist argument, but the political conditions are quite unique because of British Labourism, in that in Britain, our Social Democratic Party wasn't established as a socialist party, it was established as a Labourite party, which is really quite different. It was established as the political wing of the labour movement. Its early leaders, its early ideological figureheads rejected the notion of class struggle. The only time Labour officially called itself socialist, ironically enough, was in 1995, when as a sop to the base of the party, Tony Blair officially inserted democratic socialist into the constitution in exchange for abandoning the party's commitment to common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, which had been inserted in 1918 by the Fabians, the Webbs, at a time of a revolutionary fervour which was sweeping Europe, where even in Britain we had the police even went on strike, the nearest this country ever came to revolution. So Labourism monopolised much of the space of the left, and that's because of the fact of the trade union link. We didn't have a communist federation of unions, of course. We have trade union Labourism, if you like, as an ideology is very different. But that proved to balance the trade union movement. It gave it stability of a sort of form which has allowed the Labour Party to survive various existential crises throughout its history, but also prevented an opening to its left. That's also to do with our electoral system, which prevents or puts a very formidable block on the emergence of any new political parties. If you look at the Communist Party, obviously, which were mass parties in places like France, Italy, and Spain, but in Britain, the biggest electoral sets the communists had was in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the prestige at the time of the Soviet Union, and its role in defeating Nazism, when 2 parliamentary seats were won by the Communist Party. So the historic role of British communism in Britain was principally within the labour movement, particularly the shop stewards, in terms of the rank and file base and organising trade union militancy. It was in the academy and universities, particularly British historians like E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill, Hobsbawm, and so on. But also, I suppose, providing the ideological foundations of the Labour left, traditionally. So in the 1950s, the British Communist Party's programme was the British Road to Socialism, and that partly because the Labour left lacked often its own kind of intellectual pedigree. Harold Wilson once said about the Labour Party as a whole that it owed more to Methodism than to Marxism, which was a simplification. That much of what became known as Bennism, which is Tony Benn, the figurehead in the late 70s, in particular in the 1980s, the intellectual foundations were provided by British communism, by the British Road to Socialism. So rather than there being that space to the left of the Labour Party, which existed in other countries, the Labourism, if you like, had contained wings which in other countries existed in fundamentally different political parties altogether. Ironically enough, British communism also provided in the ideological foundations of New Labour. Eurocommunism, the in-house journals Marxism Today, and Marxism Today provided the intellectual foundations of what became known as New Labour, so-called. We've moved away from a post-warnist economy, we have to revise the fundamental tenets of the left. Many of the figureheads of New Labour, like Peter Mandelson, began their political journeys in the Young Communist League. So I think it's just important to look at this the unique, relatively political culture of the left in Britain, which meant that the form of left-wing populism we've seen was always going to emerge within Labourism and the Labour Party rather than in a separate political formation. And that's provided all sorts of complexities and problems and contradictions, as we've seen, but I think it's worth noting because it makes it quite distinct from what's happened elsewhere. Now, of course, in this country, right, we've seen whether it be Brexitism, Farageism, the rise of the Scottish independence movement, and of course Corbynism. You've seen, of course, in this country, the longest fall in wages. We've seen in Britain as a protracted squeeze since the Napoleonic Wars. The biggest squeeze in wages of any OECD industrialised country other than Greece. And we've seen, of course, go on to the housing crisis, cuts to public services and so on. But that's collided with a crisis in the legitimacy of established national institutions. The political elite, partly many factors there, the Iraq War, the false perspectives that was provided for what turned out to be a predictably catastrophic war with the anger that provoked. The Liberal Democrats, their infamous commitment to abolishing tuition fees and the backlash that caused, particularly among younger people, when that commitment clearly was reneged on. The expenses crisis, when MPs were embroiled in a scandal over the fiddling of expenses. Now, all of these have provided or fed into a general anti-politics mood, which has not necessarily been particularly healthy from a left-wing perspective, because it's in lots of ways undermined people's faith in politics as a vehicle for political, social and economic change. It's not necessarily that anti-politics populism something which is particularly favourable to left-wing populism. And I think we've seen the consequences of that. But we've seen, of course, the financial collapse. We saw a crisis with the media, phone hacking and the Sun newspaper. We can go on. So that crisis in faith, in legitimacy, in established national institutions, the police, of course, etc., and a crisis of living standards, economic, social insecurity. And whether it be looking at why Brexit happened, whether it be looking at the rise of Corbynism, of course, you have to go back to that. Now, what we've seen in Britain, and this is why the exceptionalism, of course, doesn't work, is the crisis of social democracy, which is everywhere. And it's important to say that because the right of the Labour Party, enraged, furious as they are, it's become much easier for them to attribute Labour's undeniable problems, existential problems, to the issue of the current leadership rather than the general crisis in European social democracy. Tony Blair, of course, came to power in 1997 when that brand of politics was on the march across Europe. Gerhard Schröder in Germany, Leonard Jospin in France to a degree, of course the Nordic countries, Netherlands, the Clintons were in the White House, and so on. This is obviously a very different context, whereby whether it be the Netherlands, the Labour Party there is the second party only a few years ago, it's now collapsed to 7% in the last general election. What we've seen with PSOE, of course, in Spain, whether it be PASOK being the most notorious example, getting 44% in 2009 and then getting a tenth of that support in the next general election. And even recently, the right of the Labour Party has looked to Germany as a lifeboat. Look, change leader, Martin Schulz, and that was the great hope of that wing. Of course, now the Social Democrats, even in Germany, which hasn't had suffered the same consequences of crisis as a country such as Britain, it is again in rapid retreat in the polls. Macron now is there, makes their heart beat a little bit faster at the moment. If they were, of course, to introduce a two-round presidential system and get 23% in the first round, and then have their opponent in the second round be a fascist, and maybe that formula would work in Britain as well, but obviously that isn't applicable in any form. But what, for me, I think, is, in terms of talking about populism, what I wrote, I hate people who do this, but nonetheless, what I wrote about in Chaos, which I wrote back in 2010, was of a very real danger, which I think has been realised. And that is that New Labour abandoned the politics of class. It claimed that we are all middle class now. That the old working class had been residualised, non-aspirational, was defined by its ethnicity, the so-called white working class, and so on. But it was this erasure of class politics. And what I wrote about was the danger of a savvy populist right-wing movement
which would try and fill that vacuum. It would say that the working class does exist, that it is demonised, and it's demonised. It's not it's not defined purely above all else through economic relationships, through a class of economic interests with employers, but above all else culturally, with a liberal effect middle class in large metropolitan areas, not least London, who have nothing but contempt for their patriotism and wish to destroy their way of life through mass immigration and multiculturalism. And clearly that is what has happened. That's what's being realised. That's the form of right-wing populism we've seen. Now, what's fascinating about what the Conservatives have done is this. In the 1970s, the Conservative Party said that the problem in Britain wasn't the existence of class, it was the existence of class feeling. That's what they wished to erase. And Margaret Thatcher herself said class is a communist concept, it puts people into bundles and it sets them against each other. The current Conservative Party under Theresa May, you're not talking patronising terms about hard-working families doing the right thing, which is what David Cameron and others would talk about. She's now quite openly talking about the working class, which is what UKIP, of course, traditionally have done. So what they've done, this new form of right-wing populism, is very comfortable talking about the politics of class, which was long abandoned by New Labour, and indeed by much of the left outside of New Labour, and they've appropriated it in a very, in a devastatingly effective way. Because what we've seen with Labour's electoral coalition is fissures have opened up, which they're now exploiting in a devastating fashion. And if we look at how that electoral coalition is fragmented, you get communities, working class communities in London, which tend to be more ethnically diverse and which tend to be younger, which generally speaking are more positively well disposed towards immigration and multiculturalism, which on social issues tend to be less conservative. And then you get other communities, like where I grew up in the centre of Stockport in South Manchester, where there is very little immigration indeed, where older working class voters reject immigration, see many of the problems in which they suffer economically and culturally through the prison of immigration, particularly in areas with very little immigration, and on other issues tend to be far more conservative. Now, the priorities, the worldviews of these voters are not just different, but often currently on a collision course. And that was exploited by UKIP in many of those communities. And the danger now with UKIP, as we're now seeing potentially in a devastating fashion in this general election, is they became a so-called gateway drug or transmission belt from voting Labour, abandoning Labour because you feel Labour no longer represents you, voting for UKIP and rejecting the Conservatives, not least because of the legacy of deindustrialisation in the 1980s, but now shifting off to a Conservative Party which has adopted the rhetoric of right-wing populism, which talks of, as Theresa May did, of a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere, of liberal middle-class types who despise, as I've said, the values of working-class people. And that means if in this general election Labour gets the same vote that they got 2 years ago, Labour would still lose dozens of seats, because in many constituencies across Britain, that UKIP vote is lower than the gap between Labour and the Conservatives, and they will go to a Conservative Party now infused with right-wing populism, and that will allow them to take dozens of seats, including seats they've not had for many, many generations. That, for me, is the legacy of stripping class out of politics on the left, and it has had devastating consequences because it's been appropriated by right-wing populism. Now, as I've said, in terms of the crisis of social democracy, there are many reasons for it which we've seen across Europe. One, of course, was how the new right very successfully exploited the economic crisis of the 1970s. Milton Friedman, right-wing economist, said the way you get change is through a crisis that depends on the ideas lying around. So the new right exploited the crisis We saw in this country with stagflation and so on. The defeat suffered by the trade unions, which, as I said, were the ballast of the left, the ballast of the Labour Party, and the consequences that had. The form of globalisation we've had, which seems to hem in national governments and what they seem to be able to do. The collapse of the Soviet bloc, which is portrayed as the end of history, not just as the end of any alternative to capitalism, but any alternative to free market capitalism. The shift in the nature of the working class from the industrialised working class based around workplaces like factories and steelworks to a more fragmented and atomised working class in supermarkets, call centres, offices, with more complex, with solidarity made more complex and fragmented. And then a financial crisis when social democratic parties across Europe and here as well abandoned the idea of investment in the economy, and in places like Spain introduced cuts which attacked the living conditions of their workers and their voters. And if a social democrat doesn't even support public investment, then a social democrat has nothing left to say at all. So we saw this collapse of social democracy all over Europe, and it's taken different forms. In this country, it's meant a populist left movement, almost uniquely assuming the leadership of a social democratic party, as I said, with all the complexities that's meant. Now, the problems we have, which we've seen, just to wrap up, because I think this should be opened up to the discussion. I suppose the problem, and we've seen this with left Labourism, is it's been defined, and I include myself in this, by a defensive posture, by attempting to defend existing social and economic gains won throughout our history by the political wing of the Labour movement and the Labour movement itself, rather than having any clear vision of society. And what that meant with the unexpected assumption of leadership within the Labour Party is now trying to sketch that out, whilst being in the middle of a media political firestorm. And that's what the manifesto was sought to do. It sought to answer the question of what a left-led social democratic party, how it answers the huge challenges and problems that exist in one of the wealthiest countries on earth. But what I've learned from Podemos, and I've tried to learn a lot from Podemos, and it is this, in terms of how you define your populism. And what upset many traditional leftists in Spain was withdrawing from the notion of left and right in favour of the people against the elite. Because one of the problems we've had in this country as well is an attachment above all else to symbols and flags and forms of rhetoric, which are very familiar for those like myself in America were called red diaper babies, born in my case into a Trotskyist family. But as Pablo Iglesias said, most people in Spain don't cry at the same songs that I do. In Podemos, their flag is purple, not red. The song they sing as they have their big rallies as in the Internationale. The red flag is the theme from Ghostbusters. And they have, obviously, they've moved away from that in a way that we haven't. And left Labourism is often defined by nostalgia, not least towards the 1945 Labour government. Often what left Labourism is obsessed with is recreating the same conditions that led basically to the Attlee government. We're, in a sense, constantly trying to find a way to get Clement Attlee back as Prime Minister and reverse the 1951 election defeat. And I think that has been one of the problems that defined by the nostalgia, the spirit of 45 is that Ken Loach film made. And I think that's been one of the problems that we've had. One of the other issues...
No, it's not something completely off topic, very briefly. So my name is Olivier Tonneau, and I'm running for France Insoumise in the UK. So anyone who wants to help is very welcome. That was the automatic bit. Now that's... So I have just had a very short few remarks on what was said. And the first one was about the fact that there is a democratic element to the vote for the National Front. I don't think I'm completely satisfied with this. Of course, I see that it is a rebellion against the elites, but I think even following on your work, Chantal, I think to speak of something democratic, we need more than simply the revolt against the elite. We need the participatory impulse, the desire to deliberate, things like this. And this is something that is completely absent from in the Front National among their voters or their friends. And that's a major difference if you contrast the practices that go on, if you like, in the France Insoumise, defined in France, and in the Front National. We are full of online agoras, we are full of democratic little workshops and things like this, which don't exist in the Front National. And I think that's important because the rebellion against the system can take two forms. Some say, this is not democracy and I want democracy, that's us. But others say, well, if this is democracy, then I want none of it. And many studies have showed that there is an ever stronger rejection of the very idea of democracy, and therefore a desire for a strong man who will not, so it will not be popular sovereignty, but the people being taken care of by a strong leader. Perhaps something similar to what happened in Russia. I read somewhere that the dreadful experience of ultraliberalism around 98 had been associated in the mind of the people with democracy, and this is why now the Russians are saying, well, if that's democracy, not for me. That was the first one. The second, I really try to be brief, is about charismatic leaders. I think here there is a danger of falling into an illusion that whenever a leader is successful, we say, oh, he has charisma. But in a way, we should define charisma before saying this, because if we put it this way, then we forbid ourselves the possibility that a leader could emerge without charisma. For instance, to me, it's obvious that Mélenchon has immense charisma, and also Pablo Iglesias. But Sanders, Corbyn, honestly, before they were successful, I don't think anybody would have looked at these guys and thought, that's charisma. So there is something else that they do, and maybe it's important to nuance the notion of charisma because it hides the importance of content. Actually, it is content that creates the emotions rather than the emotions creating the content. And that leads me to the third point, which is about speaking the language of the common people. Well, to me, this is typical of the spin doctors. You know, the spin doctors try to speak the language of the people they want to appeal to. And we, at Define France, we didn't do this. And that's one of the things I think that explain our success. For instance, right now in my campaign, I have some advisors who are telling me, we want 2-minute long videos, just 2 minutes, because you know the common man has an attention span and pretty much that of a goldfish. And during the campaign of Mélenchon, we did the exact opposite of this. And we made a smash of a 5-hour broadcast of our economic program. And we have very long, very complex videos, we're a very intellectual movement, and I think the common people feel very gratified by this, and they are very grateful to people who actually appeal to their intelligence. So to me, that's something very, very important. Now, I'm still trying to be quick, I'm sorry. The next point is about being anti-essentialist. That's something that, although I've read all your books with great interest, there's something that always seems a bit maybe uncomfortable because it seems that when you are an anti-essentialist, it's hard to understand how you are not an idealist. And to me, there are material conditions of existence.
No, you are not an idealist. If you're an anti-essentialist, you are an idealist, is what...
What I mean is that once we say that entities have to be constructed, then there still needs to be a way in which we integrate, if you like, material reality, although, of course, and this is where I agree with you, it can be constructed in all sorts of ways. And the way in which I find an ontological basis for populism is the precariat. I think the precariat as a status that is cross-class, you can be precarized or whatever the word would be, at every level of society, is the way in which populism can appeal to people from so many different conditions. Finally, I'll be very narrow, and I'm almost there. I want to go back to the 5 things you mentioned, Chantal, which I thought was all very interesting. First, that when you have a populist movement, you need an articulatory principle. And I think for France Insoumise, it's not just democracy, it's something very specific. It was the Constitution, rewriting of the Constitution. And the Constitution as a platform basis and as a substitute, if you like, for economic concerns that were characteristic of Marxism, I think is very promising. And this is something for you, Christophe. We did not just say we want more democracy or power to the people. We said we wanted to rewrite the Constitution, and we even said how. We want to convoke a Constituent Assembly. That was a very abstract idea, if you like, from the outset, but it worked very well. Of course, that's something we learned from Latin America. Then there is the leader. I said something about this. Yes, we need leaders, but we do not want to be simply followers of leaders. So we need leaders, we need symbols, but they don't need to be the same thing. So the leader is Mélenchon. The symbol is the Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789. And it is by distinguishing the leader from the symbol that you avoid the traps of personalization whilst remaining or whilst retaining what you need to generate affects, the kind of affects that are by definition interpersonal. And that's pretty much all I had to say. One last word, because I forgot to tell you this when I came to you after the discussion about the populism of Macron. My thesis is that Macron is a populist because there is an us and them, and the them is the state. There is a Trump element in Macron that is very strong. So In the US, a left-wing populist is anti-Wall Street, and a right-wing populist is anti-Washington. Yeah. And Macron is anti-Washington. But he says it very discreetly because he remains within the orbit of power himself. But so the concept that he uses, which is very perverse, is the civil society. He is the candidate of the civil society. It's very interesting if you try to define what is not the civil society, civil as opposed to what, you struggle a lot. So there is a sort of empty space where everybody can put their naughty, powerful guy of their choice. And the one thing I forgot to say to you is that a sign of this similarity is that just as Trump made much of the fact that he was running his campaign on his personal funds, Macron has constantly said, I am not running on public funds. I am not campaigning on public funds. And by this he meant that all the other politicians were actually sucking the blood of the people through the state and taxes and so on. So to me that's a populism. Okay, sorry if that was a little bit more.
All right. We are going to take a series of questions and then we will... wait a second, not only question, it's also comment, obviously. In fact, many of the points that Olivier made will comments. So let's...
Thanks for the discussion, that was really interesting. I'm going to just launch a short question so you can discuss it. And I'm not trying to be essentialist here, but I was wondering that if this is a left-wing populism, whether we could come up or at least venture some ideas of how an economic horizon for this left-wing populism looks like, or what does it look like? Because we agreed that it's not enough to just defend the remnants of the sort of the Keynesian consensus from 45 to 73, but so what are we looking at in the future for this left-wing? Like, okay, let's say we achieve power, but what kind of like alternatives are we pushing through in the economic world, and what connection does it have to popular mobilization? So can you mobilize people around, for instance, the ecological commons, or can you mobilize people around new sort of innovation policies, new industrial policies? Yeah, that's my question.
I'm going to talk about from the perspective. I'm Dr. Ivette Fernandez from UCL Institute of Education. I'm going to talk from the perspective of the South.
It's difficult to listen to you. Maybe you...
Can you hear me now?
Speak a bit louder, please.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now?
please.
So I'm going to talk about from the perspective of the South, and one of the things that going to the scientists proposed, is the idea that social movements are producing their own intellectuals, they are producing their own epistemologies. In many ways, they are using the hegemony in a counter-hegemonic way with counter-hegemonic views. And I was wondering how this idea of left-wing populism in Europe is giving a space to this intellectual side within social movements.
I just wanted to make a comment on what Christophe said, and I told him it is about I think, very smart decision of Mélenchon not to discuss whether he's a populist or not, because I agree that the politicians, at least from Latin America, what I see is that the successful populists have never discussed if they were populist or not, they just were populist. So I think it saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of discussions for the politicians. They just have to be populist and use the logic of construction of political identities using that. There is also a question I wanted to ask, and it's a kind of thought that I have that has to do with this issue that the way I see it, populism is essentially about constructing identity, so it is identity politics. And I'm afraid Owen is not here, but he mentioned this issue of having forgotten about classes. And I find this is a constant controversy between being populist left-wing and being left-wing. And I wonder to what extent wouldn't it be useful somehow to start thinking about not necessarily the concept of classes, but the structural determinants of what leads people to vote or to be in one movement and in another movement. Because my perception is that, especially in Europe, not so much in Latin America, the neoliberal consensus is so strong that it is very difficult to reach even the most marginal sectors with different discourses, with just an alternative discourse, whether this is not necessary to also emphasize this more material side of the proposals. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can answer no, because we don't want to, if we don't stop at some point the question, we are going to forget. So I think that all of us in a sense have been interpolated. So somebody, why don't you?
Right, yeah, I wanted to give an answer to Olivier on if I have to speak in my language, I will change my lesson learned. Okay, I wanted to answer Olivier about the fact of speaking the language of the common people. I think that's somehow necessary, because as I put in my presentation, the left has somehow taught the language. And by language, I mean something more than simple language. You know, it has been distant. It has been, really not. It does not understand. It does not be understanding what was going on in society. It has somehow shown a complete alterity with respect to the experiences of the common man. And so speaking their language doesn't mean, speaking at a very simplified level. It also means engaging with your problems. It also means somehow restarting to capture, like, going down to the bottom of society and trying to, understand what their daily preoccupations are. And linguistically, yes, I think that somehow you need to diversify registers. I think one of the most, and I think you might confirm this to me, one of the greatest intuitions of Podemos is that you can speak in a very simple and linear way in certain contexts in order for people that don't deal with critical theory to understand it, but yet at the same time that doesn't impede you from having a complex philosophical thought. And I think they've been sort of administrating these different registers very well, and I think it's an amazing operation. And possibly we may even introduce an internet sort of middle level, which means translating into policies, into strategies, the big philosophical intuitions. Well, in terms of economic horizon, that's a great question, but I'm not an economist, and I'm going to shield myself. But I think that somehow, and I'm not sure that's that's only part of the answer. But I think recuperating, when it's not like a lot of people feel nostalgic of the of the defenses, of the kind of certainties that the welfare state, the community welfare state offered. And I think some of those things need to be recuperated. Some coordinates of that imaginary need to be put back in place and need to be put at the forefront of the political battle. That doesn't make an economic policy. And I don't have the skills, I don't have the instruments to answer you to that. But I think that in terms of constructing a populist discourse, recuperating some of those, garantia, is certainly one thing that populist, left-wing populists should have in mind. And that's all I have to say for now.
Okay, so there are many interesting things about the comment about charisma. I do not conceive of charisma as some sort of personal attribute. Of course, there are people who have charisma or are more, as a kind of extroversion or ability to communicate, and that's important in politics. But when I was underlining the charismatic element, is one that transcends issues of personality. Is also a certain contradictory thing, because it's the ability to become something. So it's something that you need the leader to do, but at the same time it's something you need to happen to the leader. So I don't think Bernie Sanders is like the most charismatic person in the psychological sense of the word, but at the same time, he became precisely for the unlikeliness of a 70-something Jewish East Coast politician to symbolize, to become the tool, the element, the communicative element of, a discourse of social justice, a discourse that could give an explanation, and this relates to your other point. Not a banalizing explanation, not necessarily a simplification of things, saying everything that's happening to you is the fault of Wall Street, but an alternative narrative to explain the political economy of reality that has the ability to catch, not simply to be coherent, not simply to be, to be rigorous, which in a certain sense, and that is a classical problem of the political vocabulary of the left, tends to fall into the dogmatic. I'm not saying dogmatic here as some sort of moral adjective, but the sense that since we have been in the left so obsessed about the role of theory for so long, it is so important to have the correct theory that once you have it, the impulse, the instinct that one has is to feed it to the people on every possible occasion, so that anything that happens is an occasion to enlighten the people into the path of theory. And that's just a very bad way of doing politics, I think. So it's not speaking the language of the common man or woman or the ordinary as a simplification or a banalization. It's being able to speak in ways that are productive, of doing things with what we say, of not simply unilaterally unloading a political ready-made grammar and vocabulary, but being able to adapt, being able to retrace those boundaries, even and also around issues that have been uncomfortable for the left, that we have not been used to be able to, to articulate in a productive manner. I think that is a very complex operation. I think also that Mélenchon is not the standard, because he has that professorial ability, and he is able to maintain an audience listening carefully for hours because he has that capacity. But you can have that capacity and not being able to move things, from where they are. You can convince people that you're right, but another thing, charisma means that you ignite something, that you create a machine that works on its own. You become the symbol of something that can reproduce itself, and that is essential. Just one thing about the horizon. I mentioned it in my intervention, and I think it is true. It is true. It's a lack and a weakness. But at the same time, the horizon, that's why I call it a horizon. The horizon is something that moves with your movement, right? That you never get closer to the horizon. As an ideal, has a lot of force and of power, but also has a fictionary component to it. It's a projection. So when, I'm banalizing here a little bit, but the society without classes, the society of the new man wasn't the new woman. It was conceived as the society of the new man, right? As a society without conflict, that kind of thing. The force of the ideal certainly is useful, but at the same time, I think that from 2011, we witnessed forms of political organization that do not refuse conflict, that understand that conflict will always be present, that there is no one magic solution in the realm of the economy that then will produce a form of political society that will be more equal, more fraternal, and so forth. So I think the two things are true. We are facing a moment in which we are lacking a solid enough set of economic tools that will allow us to propose an alternative model, and at the same time, I think it is a virtue that we have transcended that model of metaphysical horizons that
simply project politics into the future to dissolve them there. If we manage to build a better society, a more democratic society, a society with more social justice, there will be a lot of conflict in that society, I think. And that is a positive premise to build a democratic movement, I think.
Okay, I'm going to answer Olivia's question about, well, it's not really a question, it's kind of an objection to what I say about the importance to recognize that they are democratic. I reiterate, for me it's absolutely central to recognize that bottom of the success of right-wing populism is the fact that they are, but if we see right-wing populism, well, populism in general, but in this case right-wing populism, as a rejection of post-politics, a rejection of post-democracy. I think there is clearly, because here, of course, as a democracy understood in a specific sense, but which is absolutely for me central to democracies, the assertion of popular sovereignty. I mean, you can't say that there is a society which is democratic if people don't have the possibility, when they go to the election, to really, choose between real alternatives. And this is, of course, as I say, post-politics is based on the fact that there is no alternative to liberal globalization. So when social democratic or social liberal parties come to power, the only thing they can do is to manage in a more humane way, so to speak, neoliberal globalization. But there is no alternative. And in fact, so there is no real democracy. There is no, the idea of popular sovereignty is being eliminated, being obsolete. That is something that should not even be considered as a value today. And I think that what the force of those parties, and I've seen that already, for instance, when I was studying the role and the success of Haider and the FPÖ in Austria, is that it was saying there is an alternative, and Marine Le Pen, there is an alternative, and we are going to give back to the people the voice which has been confiscated by the elites. So this is something that resonates. People say, okay, yeah, I'm going to be given a voice. Of course, the question is that this voice is articulated in a xenophobic way. But this is where I think that there is really a democratic demand. And I think it's very important, because I'm absolutely against all the people, and there are quite a lot in the left, who say, on the model of Hillary Clinton, the deplorables. Say, those people are, we should not even consider the demand of the people. I remember I was, for instance, extremely shocked when in 2000 there was in Austria the coalition between the ÖVP and the FPÖ. At that moment, the FPÖ had managed to get 27% of the vote. And Elfriede Jelinek, the Nobel Prize, declared we should not even speak with the people who vote for the FPÖ. Those are, I thought it's absolutely ridiculous. 27% of the people that, so we should try to understand why those people. We can't just say they are homophobe or no. And I think that this is precisely why I insist we need to see that behind that there is a cry for participation. And the left, and that's for me one of the reasons for which left-wing populism must really understand that and give another answer to that demand. And I think the problem, of course, is that in most of European countries, social liberal parties, which should be the one who have been taken, those demands into account, have completely abandoned them. They have opened the road for right-wing populism. For instance, let's say Marine Le Pen goes to the people who are abandoned by the social liberal party, and she said, I understand your douleur, what's that in English? Pain, your pain, I understand your pain. Yeah. But you see, the problem are the immigrants. You know, if you are like that, it's because of the immigrants who construct those people in a xenophobic way. And also the force of left populism and what is to go and speak to those people and say, yeah, I understand your pain, but you see the problem is not the immigrant, the problem is neoliberal globalization, is the forces of that. So this is, but in order to do that, we need to have some understanding that those people should not just be relinquished and abandoned. And so I insist that there is a real democratic demand in the sense of wanting to have a voice, but which of course is constructed in a particular way and in a xenophobic way. So we need to speak to that demand, understand, and then construct it, give it another answer.
There are a lot of things. Just on the charisma too, I agree with Pablo. I think that obviously, as I told you, as I mentioned, it is a sensitive issue in the French debate about left-wing populism, especially coming from the radical left. That's the point. But I think the problem is that we have to work on the issue, because the leader, in the framework of a populist political building, the problem that the leader is the representation of the movement himself. And that's the point. That's a sort of a way to build a new representative figure of the movement. So with the leader on the one hand, you start from that moment, which I call destituent moment, where people reject the legitimacy of organizations and institutions. And so that's the starting point. And through the leader, this movement is representing itself from its great diversity, and step by step is building its own identity. And that's where the ability is, where the leader can become a sort of, he can capture the movement, and you can have some problems. But on the other hand, we have to keep that in mind and to understand that this representation mechanism is absolutely necessary in human communities. I mean, it's almost an anthropological question. It has always been like that. So how, from that point of view, how to go to the second moment, to the second phase, which is to let and to find mechanism and dynamics in order to have a sort of emancipation of the movements and of the organizations from the leader. That's what should be tried as a roadmap for that kind of proposal strategy. But it is not easy. It is not easy because, I'm just thinking like this, it is not easy because the strategy, we know how to manage this strategy in the framework of a conquest, if I can say, how to build ourselves and to win for a campaign, for example. But to be in power, to be at the government within the state is a new story, because you have to stick to, you have to fight, and you have to be in a confrontative position with the institutions, with the old world is still there, even if you won by democracy. There are a lot of contradictions rising, and I observe that in Latin America. That's a part of the story. When you win the election, you don't have the power. You have a part of the power. The old world powers are still in the room. Private sectors, media system, administrations, and so on. So it's very difficult to keep alive the coherence and the solidarity of the movement you have built during the previous sequence. And that's why it is coming the tension. Generally, the answer is to stay behind the leader, because he ensures you a sort of permanent position in this conflict. But in the same time, you can lose the emancipation of the movement. And that's where we are today. And these parts of the reflection, from my point of view, has to be pursued, because it is not, we have no theory for that today. We have some experiences, observations, but not a theory for that. But this is why we have to accept, on the one hand, if I can say, this situation and the role of individuals, because they are key roles. Without those people, nothing will exist. At the same time, we have to be clear about the difficulties you have once you are in power. That's where. Alors, in France, I think it's a bit the same situation maybe in Spain with Podemos. We can say that France Insoumise is in between, because it has been a big success campaigning, the rise of a new political subject, etc. But we are not in the government. We will see what will happen with the parliamentary elections that will take place in June. We will see what will happen if we play a key role to prevent a majority for Macron. That's what we will see. But we will have also to build this answer in the framework of back to the normality, if I can say, with a strong movement who is not in power, but with something else than just the left, the traditional left, marginalized in the political national landscape. That's where we are, and that's why we need urgently to work on that and to combine analysis. That's why I think that kind of moments are very important, because I think that we should, I don't know, I have no concrete idea, but I think we should have a sort of mechanism to exchange, to continue to talk about the people like us who are more or less experiencing new kind of political proposal from this left-wing populism theory.
Okay, let's have a second round of question.
So it was mentioned a few times during the debate that the left must recall democracy, reinvigorate democracy against excessive liberalism, and especially neoliberalism. So against that, contemporary communists fully reject the institution of liberal democracy. So I was wondering what your position or view of thinkers like Edelmetyu, Slavoj Zizek, for example, or Jody D at that level, and how your position first. And linked to this, I was wondering, and in view of these two debates, do you think a return of the antagonism between revolutionary and radically reformist left, for example, would be something that we should strive to achieve? So return of that old antagonism.
So I'm interested in the way that democracy and democratic practice is being discussed. So I'm going to stand on Director of Centre Study of Democracy, so welcome again. This idea of sort of reclaiming popular sovereignty, which Chantal talked about having democratic choices, having alternatives, and this sort of demand for being given a voice. Sometimes with the left-wing populism, that seems to be enough, that there is this alternative programs being offered. But I'm interested in the extent to which left-wing populism entails actually new democratic practices being established. Now, obviously, in Podemos, there has been this kind of quite active participation to be part of the sort of campaigning, but I also know that there have been tensions between a kind of leadership that has wanted to sort of put forward a programme and a time and place which has wanted to be much more participatory in creating that programme. I'm just interested about how we manage that tension between, or how we can manage that tension, which is a demand for new ways of doing things, but maybe part of that being a demand for new forms of democratic practice, and not just in terms of developing a sort of campaigning, but actually institutionalising and thinking about new forms of engagement. And I like the point we made about we lack an economic imaginary or an economic alternative. I sometimes still think that the left is missing a democratic alternative. And if Owen had been here, it would be interesting. A lot of to hear his views on this, a lot of the Labour manifesto is about what the state is going to do for the people, rather than actually people being involved in that process of political decision making and political engagement in decisions that affect their lives. So I'm kind of interested to know how the left manages that, not just offering a programme of this will be a better world, but actually how we're part of that, how we're part of that process.
So my comment is again about if Macron can be seen as a populist or not. And I think what we saw in the French elections, at least in my opinion, is a competition between three parties that were competing to inherit a system that was obviously in decay or was no longer able to represent the people. And those three projects were obviously the Protestant and also Macron, as yes, of course, as a recycling of the same system, but it was a contestant in this competition to see who is going to be inheriting the liberal institutions that are at the moment in decay. And if we see in this competition, we can see that whoever, it's the people that are going to decide who wins that competition, and because of that, every